Still reading through Evidence That Demands a Verdict, still talking about the resurrection and naturalistic theories that try to explain away the resurrection. So today we're going to talk about the legend theory, the idea that the tomb being empty and Jesus resurrecting bodily was a later legendary development. Idea that the tomb being empty and Jesus resurrecting physically, about it being a later legendary development, is noted by ancient historian Richard Carrier. So he believes in the beginning there were two schools of thought. First school of thought was that Jesus resurrected spiritually. Second school of thought is that Jesus resurrected bodily and physically. And as time went on throughout the years, the school of thought that Jesus resurrected physically and bodily eventually won out over the school of thought that Jesus resurrected spiritually. Rejects the naturalistic explanation that Jesus resurrected physically and bodily, and also rejects the idea that the tomb being empty was an actual historical event. He starts off by noting some of the reasons for his belief is he points us to Mark's narrative in the gospel, and all the other gospels kind of came after Mark, and he thinks the tomb being empty and Jesus resurrecting physically, basically Mark just invented it. That for Mark, the idea that the tomb being empty wasn't so important that it was historical as much as it was symbolic. For Mark, he wanted to the empty tomb represented the core gospel, and it wasn't that big of a deal for the tomb actually being empty as much as he was just trying to paint this picture and create the significance of Jesus' resurrection. And he also points out the idea that Mark's narrative has this reversal of expectation theme. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But first, so Richard Carrier, he basically has like three strands of hypothesis as to how we got here as far as the tomb being empty and Jesus resurrecting physically and bodily. First strand is that the resurrection has psalmic origins. So he's saying Psalms 22, Psalms 23, and Psalms 24 basically are direct parallels between the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. The second strain is that Mark's narrative has Orphic origins, and we'll talk a little bit about what the Orphic is. But basically, that the Orphic origins is like a pagan religion. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but it has parallels between Mark's gospel and the Orphic doctrine. And Mark's empty tomb mimics the secret salvation narrative of the Orphic mysteries. And then the third one is this reversal of expectation theme. So the reversal of expectation theme, you see, Jesus had these parallels, and the Gospels are kind of full of it. I wrote down a couple. So you have the king suffering and dying, the expectation. The Messiah would be a conquering king who would overthrow Rome. And then you have this reversal of expectation. What actually happened was that Jesus comes as a suffering servant, and that instead of a military victory, his triumph is through death and resurrection. You also have the crucifixion basically being a victory. So the death of Jesus is actually reversed into a win for Christianity. So the death on a cross is a shameful sign of defeat. Now the reversal of that, Jesus' crucifixion, becomes the greatest victory and conquering of sin and death. And so just like those reversal of expectations, when Jesus' body is put into the tomb, you would think that there's a body put in there, but reversal, it's actually empty, meant to surprise the reader and the audience. We'll kind of break down each one of these strains, but just take a second, go back to the Orphic doctrine. So what the Orphic teaching is, it comes from this guy Orpheus, who was a legendary musician. It's recorded and supposed prophet, and his teaching supposedly revealed secret knowledge about the afterlife. So Orphics believed in reincarnation, and the goal of salvation was to escape this cycle and reunite with the divine. And a key theme of salvation was death and rebirth, often symbolized in myths like Orpheus descending to the underworld to rescue Eurydice. And he kind of connects this to the gospel narrative because Orphism taught that divine vigor suffers and then triumphs over death, just like Jesus suffered and then triumphed over death. But a couple of reasons as to why it this is kind of controversial and doesn't really line up. So one, there's lack of direct evidence, no clear proof that Mark was copying the Orphic myths. And then most scholars will agree that Mark's narrative had Jewish roots. Most scholars see Jewish scriptures like Isaiah and Psalms as Mark's primary influence, not Greek mysteries. And then third was the difference in the resurrection concept. So Orphics believed in reincarnation and soul purification, while Jesus' resurrection was actually bodily and physical and was an actual historical event. So in response to the idea that the empty tomb and Jesus resurrecting bodily was a legendary development, so in response to that altogether, so number one, it totally ignores the fact that the church from the very inception of the church preached the risen Jesus. So if this idea was a later legendary development, why are they preaching this immediately upon everything happening? Secondly, the teaching occurred where it took place, where the resurrection took place. It would be so easy for whoever is being preached to go and verify the claims. Thirdly, the teaching began like 50 days after the resurrection. So if it's a later legendary development that developed like years later, but you're preaching this like 50 days after the resurrection, come on. And then fourth, to disprove it, all you had to do was just come up with the body. Now I understand we can't come up with the body now, but then, if you're preaching in the very same place that the resurrection happened, preaching to people who knew where the body was buried, you have the women, you have the male disciples, you have Joseph of Arimathea, you have the Jewish leaders who would have been very concerned about where Jesus was buried. If they heard this preaching that Jesus resurrected and they wanted to put a stop to it, I think they would probably try to put a stop to it and just show them the body. That would have been the end of Christianity right there, but they couldn't because Jesus resurrected. You also had the guards. You had Pilate. Pilate probably would have been very concerned about Jesus resurrecting and where he was buried. So overall, Sean notes that there's not a lot of scholars that really align with the legendary theory. And so now let's talk a little bit about what did Christianity begin by mistake. Another one of Richard Carrier's theories is that did Christianity begin by mistake? So he goes on to say that perhaps Jesus wasn't really buried in the tomb that was known by his followers, by Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus was buried in a special graveyard that was reserved for criminals. And as a result of that, when the women went to visit Jesus' tomb, they discovered that the tomb was empty, therefore thinking that Jesus is alive, that he resurrected. But it's a mistake because he was never really buried in that tomb to begin with. He was actually buried in the graveyard, and the women that discovered the empty tomb just didn't know about it. Response to the criminal graveyard, that he was buried Saturday instead of Friday, it's common Jewish custom that the burial took place on the day of death. And Joseph of Arimathea, he would have been directly concerned about getting Jesus buried in observance of the law. And since it was the Sanhedrin that was responsible for killing Jesus, Joseph is part of the Sanhedrin. Joseph directly would have had the responsibility of carrying out the burial practices for Jesus. In addition, the Jewish law, it prohibits burial on the Sabbath and festivals. And as a consequence, Jesus would have been buried Friday night before sundown, and this rule even went for criminals. See, and lastly, the idea that Jesus was buried in a criminal's graveyard, there's a lot of historical data and evidence that provides us evidence that Jesus was buried in a tomb. So this theory doesn't really jive with history. So in conclusion, of all the analysis that we have, we can be pretty sure that Joseph was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb and that Christianity did not begin by mistake.